The funeral was on a Thursday. Late October in Vermont, the kind of afternoon when the maples have already gone red and the wind off Lake Champlain carries a bite that gets into your bones. I remember thinking, as we lowered her into the ground at St. Mark's, that Lillian would have hated the cold. She'd spent 43 years complaining about New England winters, even though she was born in Burlington and never seriously considered living anywhere else. My name is Howard. Howard Tremaine. I was 67 years old that day, and my wife of 41 years had died on a Sunday morning while I was making her tea in the kitchen. Pancreatic. 8 weeks from diagnosis to grave. The doctors had been kind. The hospice nurses had been kinder, and our son had been 3,000 miles away in San Diego, calling once a week to ask how things were going. He flew in for the funeral, of course. My son Bradley, 42, a financial advisor at one of those firms with 3 names that all sound like law offices. He brought his wife Krista and their 2 kids, my grandchildren, who I hadn't seen in person since the previous Christmas. Bradley wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, and Krista wore black with a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother, and the kids wore whatever their parents had picked out for them and stood there looking confused, the way kids do at funerals, not because they don't understand death, but because they don't understand why all the adults are pretending so hard not to fall apart. After the service, we went back to the house. Our house, the one Lillian and I had bought in 1986, in a quiet neighborhood in South Burlington, the one we'd raised Bradley in, the one I'd painted 3 times and re-roofed twice, and put a new furnace in just 2 winters ago. People came by with casseroles. A woman from Lillian's book club brought a lemon pound cake that she'd been making for 40 years, and that everyone in our circle pretended to enjoy. Father Donnelly stayed for an hour and drank weak coffee, and told me, in his soft Irish way, that grief is the price we pay for love, and that we'd both known what we were buying when we signed up for it. I appreciated that. I always have. And then, around 6 o'clock, when most of the mourners had left and the kids were upstairs in Bradley's old bedroom watching something on a tablet, Bradley sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Dad, we need to talk about what happens next." I should tell you something about Bradley. He wasn't a bad kid. I want to be clear about that. He'd been a sweet boy, soft-hearted, the kind who cried when we had to put down the family dog, and who used to write Lillian poems on Mother's Day. But somewhere around college, somewhere around the time he met Krista at Boston University, and started dating into a family that summered on Nantucket, something hardened in him. He started measuring things. He started talking about people in terms of their trajectory. He started using phrases like asset allocation at Thanksgiving dinner. By the time he was 30, the boy who'd cried over a beagle was gone, and what remained was a man who calculated. "What do you mean, what happens next?" I asked. He looked tired. I'll give him that. We were both tired. He pulled a folder out of the leather satchel he'd brought with him, the kind of bag that probably had a name and a designer, and he set it on the table between us. "Krista and I have been talking," he said. "We're worried about you, Dad. You can't stay here alone." I looked at the folder. I didn't open it. "I've been alone in this house for about 30 hours, Bradley," I said. "I think we can take it slow." "That's not what I mean. You know that's not what I mean. The house is too big. The yard is too much for one person. The winters here are brutal. You're 67 years old. I know how old I am. Dad." He had a particular way of saying that word. He'd been doing it since he was 16. That exasperated, drawn-out dad that managed to communicate disappointment and condescension in 2 syllables. I'd never figured out how to respond to it. Lillian used to laugh when he did it. She used to say, "Howard, our son thinks he's the parent now." She said it with affection. She wasn't wrong. "What's in the folder, Bradley?" He opened it. Inside was a glossy brochure for a place called Birchwood Meadows. The cover photo showed a smiling, silver-haired couple sitting on a porch swing surrounded by autumn leaves. The kind of stock photo that gets used on every retirement community's marketing material in the entire country. I'd seen that exact same couple advertising hearing aids, and reverse mortgages and supplemental Medicare plans. It's a senior living community in Williston, he said. Krista's aunt lives there. It's got everything. 3 meals a day, social activities, a fitness center, on-site medical staff. You'd love it, Dad. You'd be around people your own age. I'm around people my own age right now. I just buried one. He winced. To his credit, he winced. That's not fair. No, I said. It probably isn't. I'm sorry. What's the rest of the folder? He pulled out another set of papers. These were thicker, more official looking, with little colored tabs marking places to sign. Krista's been doing some research on the financial side of things. The smart move, the really smart move, is to transfer the deed of this house to me and Krista now, while you're still healthy. It avoids probate complications down the road. It protects the asset from any potential medical expenses, and it lets us handle the sale and put the proceeds toward your residence at Birchwood. It's just cleaner. I looked at him. I really looked at him, my only son, the boy who'd once spent a whole afternoon trying to teach a stray cat to high-five. I tried to find that boy in the man across from me, and I couldn't. You want me to sign the house over to you. Dad, it's not. You want me to sign the deed to the house your mother and I bought in 1986, the house you grew up in, over to you and your wife. Today. The day of your mother's funeral. It doesn't have to be today, obviously. We can do it tomorrow, or next week. But we should get it started, Dad. These things take time. I stood up. I walked over to the sink. I turned on the tap and let the water run for a minute, watching it swirl down the drain, because I needed to do something with my hands, and I needed to not look at him for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree Lillian had planted when Bradley was 8 was shedding the last of its leaves. They drifted down in lazy spirals, red and yellow and orange. I need to think about it, I said. Of course. Take your time. But Dad, he stood up too, came over and put a hand on my shoulder, the way you touch a horse you're trying to calm. Don't take too much time. Krista and I really do think this is the best path forward. For everyone. For everyone. For everyone. Right. I didn't sleep that night, or rather, I slept in fragments, the way you do when grief is fresh, and in between the fragments I lay on Lillian's side of the bed, because mine still smelled like the cologne I'd worn to the funeral, and I couldn't stand it. I thought about my son. I thought about Krista, who had always been polite to me in that careful, frosted way that people use with relatives they tolerate. I thought about my grandchildren, who were going to grow up thinking of me as the grandfather in the institutional dining hall, the grandfather they visited on holidays and felt sorry for. And I thought about Lillian. Most of all, I thought about Lillian. You have to understand something about my wife. Lillian was, by trade, a translator. She translated French novels into English for a living, and she was good at it. Good enough that she had a steady stream of work for 40 years and a reputation in the small world of literary translation. She did it from a desk in our spare bedroom, surrounded by dictionaries and stacks of paper and a half-dozen pens she'd chewed on, while trying to find the right English word for some French phrase that didn't quite have an equivalent. She'd worked on Maupassant and Guide and a number of contemporary writers I'd never heard of, before she introduced me to them. We lived modestly on her earnings and my pension from the State Highway Department. We'd taken vacations to Quebec, and once to Paris, and once, memorably, to a small village in the Loire Valley, where Lillian had spent her junior year of college, and where she'd fallen so deeply in love with the language that it shaped the rest of her life. What Bradley didn't know, what I had never told him, because Lillian had asked me not to, was that 12 years earlier Lillian had translated a memoir written by a French actress. The memoir had become an unexpected international bestseller, and the English translation, Lillian's translation, had been the version that got picked up in the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada. The actress had died 3 years after the book came out, which had created a whole second wave of sales. The royalties had been substantial. They were still substantial. The check that arrived every 6 months from the publisher in New York, in Lillian's name, was around $140,000. twice a year, every year, for 12 years. Lillian had insisted from the very first check that we not change our lives. She'd grown up poor in a town in the Northeast Kingdom, and she had a horror of money making people stupid. So we kept living in the same house. I kept driving the same car, a 2009 Subaru I'd bought used. We let the kitchen counters get worn, and we let the wallpaper in the dining room peel a little, and we didn't replace the couch even though one of the cushions had gone flat. And the money piled up. And then, 8 years ago, Lillian had bought a house in Maine, a small house, an old house, on the coast just outside a town called Stonington, on Deer Isle. It had belonged to a poet she'd corresponded with for years, and when the poet died, Lillian had bought it from the estate in cash, in her own name, without telling anyone. We started spending 2 weeks there every summer, and a long weekend every fall. Bradley had never been. He'd been busy with his career and his children and his vacation home in Big Bear, and somehow we'd just never gotten around to inviting him. Or rather, Lillian had never gotten around to it. I followed her lead. "He doesn't need to know," she'd said once, sitting on the porch of the main house and watching the lobster boats come in. Bradley would just see numbers. He wouldn't see this. She'd waved her hand at the cove and the seagulls and the gray shingled salt box 100 yards away, with smoke coming out of the chimney. "That's not nice, Lillian." "I know it's not nice. I'm not always nice." "I've been a translator for 40 years, Howard, and one thing translation teaches you is that you can't make someone see what they don't want to see. You can only put the words in front of them. And our son does not want to see this. He wants to see a balance sheet." I hadn't argued with her. I should have, maybe. But I hadn't. So that night, the night after the funeral, I lay in bed and I thought about all of this. The main house, the royalties, the savings account in Lillian's name, with 3 years of those royalty checks parked in it because we hadn't quite figured out what to do with them. The trust she'd set up 2 years ago when she'd first started feeling tired all the time and hadn't yet known why, the lawyer in Montpelier whose name was on a card in my wallet. The letter Lillian had written and sealed and put in the safe deposit box and made me promise I wouldn't open until after she was gone. I had opened it 3 days before, on the morning of the funeral. I had read it twice, and then I had folded it carefully and put it back in my breast pocket, and I had carried it with me to the church and to the cemetery and back to the house, and I was carrying it still as I lay in the dark and listened to my son and his wife talking in low voices in the guest room down the hall. "He's going to push back," Krista was saying. I could hear her clearly. The walls in our house were thin in the upstairs hallway. They always had been. "He'll come around. He always does. He's stubborn, Bradley. He's tired. He's grieving. We just need to be patient and firm. Mom would have wanted this." I almost laughed out loud at that. I almost got up and walked down the hall and asked him what exactly he thought his mother would have wanted, and how he had come to be such an authority on it, given that he had called her, on average, once every 3 weeks for the last decade, and had not made it home for either of her last 2 birthdays. But I didn't. I just lay there. I lay there and I thought about Lillian's letter, the one in my breast pocket, and the line near the end that I had read and reread until I could see it with my eyes closed. "You will know when. Trust yourself. Trust me." In the morning I made coffee and waffles, and we all ate together in the kitchen. The kids and Krista and Bradley and me, and we talked about nothing for an hour. Then the kids went to play in the backyard, and Krista said she was going to take a walk to clear her head, and Bradley refilled his coffee and looked at me across the table. "Have you thought about it, Dan?" "I have. And I want to talk to a lawyer." He blinked. "A lawyer?" "Yes. Before I sign anything that significant, I want to talk to a lawyer. I'm sure you understand." "Of course. Of course. Krista and I can recommend someone. There's a guy in Boston who—" "I have my own lawyer, Bradley. Your mother and I have been using the same firm in Montpelier for 30 years. A small thing happened on his face. It was the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd been watching him since he was a baby. A tiny tightening at the corner of his mouth. A microscopic recalibration. Of course, he said again. Sure, why don't you give them a call this week and see what they say? We can get back together next weekend. I can fly back out, no problem. You don't need to fly back. We can do it over the phone. Dad, this is important. I want to be there, in person. I'll think about it. He drove back to the rental car place that afternoon. They were flying out of Burlington at 5. Before he left, he hugged me. A real hug, the kind he used to give me when he was a teenager and had done something he felt bad about. I almost broke. I almost said, Bradley, please, don't be the man you're trying to be. Be the boy who wrote your mother poems. Be the one who cried over the dog. But I didn't say that. I hugged him back. I told him to call me when they landed. I waved at the kids in the back seat, and they waved back. And then the rental car pulled out of the driveway, and I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty chair across from me, where Lillian had sat for 41 years, and I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I called the lawyer. His name was Walter Henning. He had been Lillian's lawyer first. She'd hired him in her 30s to handle her translation contracts, and he had become mine by extension. He was 74 years old, sharp as a tack, and he had a way of speaking that made you feel like he was always slightly amused by the world. He picked up on the second ring. Howard, he said. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. My condolences again. Lillian was a hell of a woman. She was. What can I do for you? I told him. I told him everything. The folder. Birchwood Meadows. The deed transfer. Krista's research. The conversation in the kitchen on the day of the funeral. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Howard, have you read the letter? I've read it. And? She told me to trust myself. She told you to trust her, which is a different thing. Lillian was a planner, Howard. She had this contingency mapped out in 2019 when she first set up the trust. She told me about Bradley. She told me what she expected might happen as she went first. And she told me what she wanted me to do. What did she want you to do? She wanted me to do whatever you asked me to do. And she wanted me to remind you, if you needed reminding, of what you and she had decided together about the main house, about the royalties, about the boy. He's not a boy anymore, Walter. No, Walter said. He isn't. We talked for an hour. By the end of it, I had a plan. I want to be clear about this. It was not a plan to ruin my son. I had no interest in ruining my son. I had loved him for 42 years, and I would love him for whatever years I had left, and the love would not depend on his being lovable. Because that's not how love works when it's the real kind. What I had instead was a plan to protect myself, to protect what Lillian had built, to make sure that the choices my son was about to make would be choices he made with full information, and that the consequences of those choices would land on him and not on me. The next weekend, Bradley flew back. He came alone. Krista, he said, had a thing she had to do for the kids' school. I suspected, and Walter, when I told him later, agreed that Krista was deliberately staying home so that Bradley could press me without her in the room as a witness. I don't know if that was true. It might have been. It might also have been a thing for the kids' school. People are not always plotting. Sometimes they really are at the PTA. We met at Walter's office in Montpelier. It was a small office above a coffee shop, 2 rooms and a waiting area, with a view of the gold dome of the State House through the front window. Walter had ordered sandwiches. He greeted Bradley with a handshake and a smile that managed to be warm and faintly skeptical at the same time. I'd known Walter for 30 years, and I'd never seen him look at anyone with full warmth except Lillian. He'd had a soft spot for Lillian. Bradley had brought his folder. He'd added some pages to it. He spread them out on Walter's conference table with the brisk confidence of a man who was used to handling other people's money. So, he said, the proposal is straightforward. Dad transfers the deed of the South Burlington property to me and Krista. We list it for sale in the spring. Estimated value is around 620, 650. Net of fees and capital gains, we're looking at maybe 560, 580. We use that to fund Dad's residence at Birchwood Meadows, which has an entrance fee of $320 plus monthly fees, and we put the remainder into a managed account that I'd be happy to oversee. It's a clean structure. It avoids probate. It protects the asset from long-term care exposure, and it gives Dad peace of mind. He looked at me. He looked at Walter. Walter nodded slowly as if considering. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him. He hadn't written anything on it. "Bradley," Walter said, "can I ask you a few questions?" "Of course. What is your father's current monthly income?" Bradley hesitated. "I'd have to check with Dad. But I believe his pension and Social Security come to about $5,200 a month. And his liquid savings? Around, Dad, what is it, 80,000? "Something like that," I said. 80,000, Walter said. "And his fixed expenses, currently?" "The mortgage is paid off," Bradley said. "So it's just utilities, insurance, food, maybe 2,500 a month. So your father, currently, is running a surplus of about 2,700 a month, has 80,000 in savings, owns his home outright, and has no debt. Is that correct?" "That's correct." "Then I have to ask, Bradley, what problem are we solving?" The room went very quiet. "The problem," Bradley said slowly, "is that Dad is 67. He's going to need more care eventually, and the South Burlington house is a lot to maintain. Has your father told you he's struggling to maintain it? Not in so many words. Has he told you in any words?" Bradley looked at me. He was starting to flush just a little around the collar. "I haven't said that, no," I said. "So we're solving a hypothetical future problem," Walter said. "By transferring an asset worth, by your own estimate, $650,000 out of your father's name today. Is that a fair characterization?" "It's a planning decision, Walter. I'm a financial planner. This is what I do. I understand. And what fees would you be charging your father for managing the proceeds account?" A pause. "Standard. 1%. On 580,000. So 5,800 a year in perpetuity. That's industry standard. I'm not disputing that. I'm just noting it. So to summarize, your father, who is healthy, solvent, debt-free, and lives in a home he loves and can maintain, would transfer his primary asset to you and your wife, move into a managed care facility he hasn't visited and hasn't asked about, and pay you $5,800 a year for the privilege of having you manage what's left of his money. Have I got that right?" I watched my son's face. I watched the thing happen that I had been afraid would happen. I watched his expression close. I watched the small boy I'd raised retreat behind a wall of pride and embarrassment and resentment, and I watched the man who was left look at Walter with something hard in his eyes. "You're making it sound predatory. I'm describing it, Bradley. You can decide for yourself how it sounds." "Dad," he said, turning to me, "is this what you want? You want the lawyer ambushing me? After everything we've been through this month?" I looked at him. I really did try one more time to find the boy. "Bradley," I said, "I don't want to fight with you. I'm not going to transfer the house. Not now, not next year. The house is mine. It was your mother's and mine, and now it's mine. When I die, we'll talk about what happens to it then, not before." "Dad, I'm not finished. I want to say something else, and I want you to listen, because I'm only going to say it once." He stopped. Walter sat back in his chair very still. "I love you," I said. "I've loved you every day of your life. I am proud of the things you've accomplished. I love your wife, and I love your children, and I will love you until I die. But you came into my house on the day of your mother's funeral with a folder full of papers, and you tried to walk me out of my own life. And I want you to understand something. I am going to remember that, not because I'm angry. I'm not angry. I'm too tired to be angry. But because the next time you and I talk about something important, I am going to remember the kind of man who showed up that day. and I am going to act accordingly." He didn't say anything. His jaw was working. "You can still come visit," I said. "You can bring the kids. We'll go to the lake. I'll make pancakes. Nothing has to change between us, Bradley, except that I am no longer going to pretend not to see what I'm seeing. Do you understand?" "I understand," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Good." He left the office about 10 minutes later. He shook Walter's hand stiffly. He hugged me briefly. He drove back to Burlington and got on his plane and flew back to San Diego, and I didn't hear from him for 9 days. When he finally called, it was on a Tuesday evening, and his voice was different. Smaller. Younger somehow. "Dad. Bradley. I owe you an apology." I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit. Walter had told me after the meeting that one of the most powerful things a parent could do with a grown child was to refuse to fill in the silences. "Make him do the work," Walter had said. "He's old enough. I should not have come at you like that." The day after the funeral, Krista and I had been talking about it for a while, and I think we both kind of convinced ourselves that we had to move fast, that we were doing the right thing, that we were being responsible. And then Mom died, and it just felt like the moment to do it, but I see now how it must have looked. I see how it was. I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. Thank you, Bradley. Are we okay? I thought about it. For a long time before I answered. We're getting there, I said. It wasn't quite a yes. He noticed. To his credit, he let it stand. We talked for another half hour. About the kids. About a project he was working on. About whether I'd be willing to come out to San Diego for Thanksgiving. I said I'd think about it. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with a glass of bourbon and watched the dark come down over the backyard. And I thought about how grief works, how it strips you down to the studs, how it shows you exactly what kind of house you've been living in. I drove out to Maine the following week. I closed up the house in South Burlington, set the thermostat to 55, asked the neighbor to keep an eye on things, and I got in the Subaru and drove the 6 hours to Stonington. I stayed at the main house for the entire month of November. I lit fires. I read books. I walked along the cove every morning, even when it was cold enough that my eyes watered, and I watched the lobster boats come in. I talked to Lillian out loud, not constantly, but here and there. I told her what had happened. I told her what Bradley had said, and what Walter had said, and what I had said. I told her I had done what she had asked me to do, which was to trust myself. I told her I missed her. The first royalty check after her death arrived in late November. The publisher had Lillian's address on file, but the trust had been notified and the payment was processed accordingly. $138,000 and change. I looked at the deposit notification on my phone, and I sat on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee and the wind off the water in my face, and I thought about what Lillian had built, quietly, over 40 years, and what she had protected at the end of her life by being smart enough to see what was coming. I thought about my son. I thought about the man he had become, and the boy he had been, and the man, maybe, he could still be, if grief and time and a few hard conversations did the work they sometimes do. I thought about whether I would tell him, eventually, about the royalties in the main house, about the trust, about what Lillian had set aside, which was substantial for the grandchildren, for them in their own names, and accounts they would gain access to at 25, regardless of what their parents did or didn't do. I thought about whether I would tell Bradley what was waiting for him, what was not waiting for him, what his mother had decided in her final years, about what kind of inheritance she wanted to leave and to whom. I decided I would tell him. Eventually, when the time was right, when enough water had moved under the bridge that he would hear it without flinching, without trying to run a calculation, without seeing it as a verdict. But not yet. The light faded over the cove. I went inside and made dinner. I ate alone at the small kitchen table, with a copy of one of Lillian's translations propped open in front of me, an old one, a Maupassant collection from 1992, and I read a story she had loved, a story about a man who finds a piece of string in the road and is accused of stealing a wallet and spends the rest of his life trying to convince his neighbors of his innocence, and dies a broken man because no one will believe the truth he keeps insisting on. Lillian had loved that story. She had said, once, that it was the truest story Maupassant ever wrote, because it was about how the world will believe what it wants to believe, regardless of what you tell it. And the only freedom a person has is to stop trying to convince the world of anything, and to live, instead, by what you yourself know to be true. I closed the book. I washed the dishes. I went up to bed in the small upstairs room with the slanted ceiling and the window that looked out over the water, and I slept better than I had slept in 2 months. In the morning, I got up and made coffee and went out to watch the lobster boats. The sun was coming up over the islands, and the water was the color of tin. A gull stood on the post at the end of the dock and watched me with one yellow eye. I thought about Lillian. I thought about Bradley. I thought about the years ahead, and the choices I would make in those years, and the man I wanted to be in them. I went back inside. I poured another cup of coffee. I sat down at Lillian's old desk in the corner of the living room, the one she'd written so many translations on, and I picked up one of her chewed pens and a yellow legal pad, and I started to write down everything that had happened from the beginning, because some part of me knew that one day my grandchildren would be old enough to ask, and when they did, I wanted them to have the true story, not the polished one, not the financial one, not the one their father would tell. The true one. The one their grandmother had left me to tell. I've thought a lot about that Thursday in October, the day we put Lillian in the ground, and the morning after when my son slid that folder across my kitchen table. I keep coming back to one simple idea. Every choice a person makes is a seed, and seeds grow into exactly the thing they were planted as. Bradley didn't become the man in that folder overnight. He became him slowly, over years of small decisions, each one a little colder than the last, each one rounding off another corner of the boy who used to write his mother poems on Mother's Day. And the morning after the funeral, those years of seeds bore their fruit. He couldn't have walked into my house with that folder if he hadn't already walked 1,000 times away from the harder, kinder choices that would have shaped him into someone else. I learned something in those weeks, sitting alone at Lillian's old desk in the main house. Decency isn't a feeling. It's a habit. You build it the way you build muscle, one rep at a time, and you lose it the same way. Lillian had built hers over 40 years of small, patient choices, and at the end of her life, she could see clearly because she had earned the eyesight. She set up that trust. She bought the house in Stonington. She wrote me that letter and made me promise to read it after. None of that was luck. It was the harvest of a lifetime of looking honestly at the people she loved and refusing to flinch. I want to tell you, whoever is listening to this, that you are allowed to love someone and still see them clearly. Those two things don't cancel each other out. I love my son. I will love him until the day I die, but I am not required to pretend he is someone he isn't, and I am not required to hand him my life as a tax on that love. Loving him well, in the years I have left, means letting him face the consequences of who he has chosen to be, and trusting that the man he could still become is somewhere inside the man he is. And I want to tell you something about strength, because I think we get this wrong in America. Strength isn't loud. It isn't a fist on a table. The strongest thing I did that month was sit across from my son in a lawyer's office and say, calmly, that I would not be signing. No yelling, no accusations, just the quiet refusal to disappear from my own life. Lillian taught me that. She translated other people's words for 40 years, but the language she spoke best was the one she lived in. Pay attention, tell the truth, and trust yourself when the moment comes. The moment came. I trusted myself, and I am still here in my house, watching the maple she planted shed its leaves every fall, writing this down for grandchildren who will one day be old enough to ask.